Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 5th Bitesize webinar. When we started the Bitesize, it was a way of celebrating the history of the 7 decades of conference. But in these turbulent days, it has become so much more. It is an anchor for the start of every month, in the same way the Oxford Farming Conference itself has been an anchor to the start of every year, connecting with others across our great industry on 75 occasions. We have all been finding new ways, our own ways, through these challenging days, staying within ever-changing regulations, and juggling family, work, and attempting to have fun in new and innovative ways. Reflecting on all of this, I am delighted to announce the theme for 2021 is Business as Unusual. On the same theme, we are delighted to be bringing you today from our new platform, Remo. As a conference, we have had to find new and innovative ways to operate, and we hope that Remo will give you a more interactive experience at the end of this Bitesize, where you can stay online and enjoy face-to-face or camera-to-camera conversations with other attendees. I know diaries are always busy. Unfortunately, we can't say we're in London, so can't make the meeting in Edinburgh anymore because we're all available online. But it would be great to get a chance to speak to some of you at the end to hear your thoughts on the session and where you think the industry is going. As with all our bite-sized sessions, CPD points are available from Pig Pro, Dairy Pro, Basis and Facts. Just email secretariat@ofc.org.uk to verify your attendance. There is a Q&A tab you'll see hopefully on your screens, and that is where to ask your questions. We are making changes, as you see, with Remo and as we've developed the bite-sized series, and we're introducing things step by step. So upvoting won't actually be used today, but we will, because we're concentrating on the networking capability. My fellow director, the fabulous Sarah Mukherjee, CEO of IEMA, is chairing today. I was very grateful to Sarah for stepping in at short notice last month when I was under the weather. Our 3 speakers, Shekhar, Daniel and Konrad, bring a wealth of international experience to today's session, covering India, Africa, Central America and Asia at large. And Konrad is no stranger to OFC, having delivered the Frank Parkinson Lecture in 2017. I'm very pleased to hand over to Sarah to introduce her panel.
Thanks very much indeed, Sally, and a very warm welcome from me here in the kitchen in Hertfordshire. Now, I think that when we all as directors decided to keep the Oxford movement alive and kicking through the pandemic by choosing these webinars, these bite-sized webinars, we had no idea just how resonant so many of these titles would be today. I was delighted to have the 1980s. Not only am I an Essex girl at heart with big shoulder pads and big hair, but also it was the decade that I went up to Oxford myself. And the paradox of plenty, again, is just as relevant now as it was then. When I was at the BBC as a presenter for Farming Today and environment correspondent, the one subject we continued to return to was how and why is it that farmers appear to be making very little money from the goods and services that they produced? Why was it that wherever you went in the world, farmers were finding new and innovative ways to subsidize the food that every single person on the planet needed to eat and to drink? Why is it that we spend a £5 on a coffee in a coffee house in London, but the dairy farmer and the coffee farmer who go to make up the absolutely essential parts of that coffee are struggling to pay the rent? Well, as Sally said, if anybody can begin to work their way towards the answers to these questions, it's the 3 amazing speakers that we have for you today. And I'd like to start off by asking Shekhar Bhadsavle, who is known as the godfather of Indian agro-environmentalism and agro-tourism and agro-farming, to join us first for his presentation. Shekhar, over to you.
Hello, namaste from India, and because of my language barriers, and I would like you to understand, so I'm going to read my presentation, but you can see the pictures. This paradox of plenty in agriculture implies that the bumper crop harvest by the farmer brings lesser profit to them. But in modern day situation, there are other negative issues attached to the objective of harvesting plenty with bumper profits, and they are unhealthy soil, problematic environment, and unhappy farmer. The healthy food with sustainability of production is equally important as that of producing plenty. And healthy food is possible only from healthy soil. But modern day agronomic practices, which you see in this top slide with a big machine that is with a disc harrow, it's plowing and you can see the dust blowing. Uh, this modern day agronomic practices for producing plenty is causing irreversible damage to the health of our soil. And this is likely to deprive our young ones. As you can see in this another slide here, these young ones are likely to get deprived of the healthy soil for the future generations. Healthy soil and climate smart agriculture practices only can make farming sustainable. So these are the 3 slides, and my next set of slides will show you there is severe erosion from all the arable land. And this arable land, please go to the next slide, set of next slides. Uh, there is severe erosion from all the arable land, and that this, according to scientists, we lose equivalent to Brazil into oceans each year by water and wind erosion. Again, this is due to the greed of producing plenty, where you can see even a small farmer of India, he uses this little small machine called power tiller handheld tractor. And you can see in the middle picture, in the central picture, you can see how much beautiful soil, beautiful silt that that particular land is losing. And in this another picture, you can see the 3 glasses. The same water was taken and the alum was applied. The silt has settled in, and we measured it was 20% silt we lose each time we try to take a rice crop, even by the small farmer. So this is the severe erosion that we are experiencing, the whole world is experiencing. Let's go to the next slide. The land and the soil where most of the food is produced has started dying. This is something very important. This death of soil is caused by at many places in the world due to over exploitation and greed to produce plenty. You can see in this picture here, lot of cattle migrate. This is a picture from Thailand where we were trying to teach our technique. These cattle migrates indicate anaerobic condition and production of lots of maggots. So this soil is actually dying, and you can see here this soil is actually, because these big heavy machines that they go into these big machines to do harvesting of rice, they really destroy the soil structure, and that is also a serious problem. Let's go to the next slide. So agriculture, instead of helping manage carbon sequestration, it is contributor to the tune of 30% the carbon emission. And this carbon emission, 30% carbon emission caused by agriculture can be reversed only by no-till regenerative method of agriculture. And that our team has developed a method called SRT, Saguna rice technique, that has huge potential to transfer massive quantities of atmospheric carbon into soil. this set of practices designed by our team has a solution to all these problems. And these problems, such as the farmer, the land, and the environment, all can become happy while the cost of production of food is dramatically reduced. These are some of the pictures here. This use of tractor means degenerative, and use of no-till like SRT method is a regenerative method of farming. And you can see the happy farmers. So what we have already been told by great people like Albert Einstein, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking here, degenerative, with the same thinking that created them in the first place. So we need to go from flat earth theory to round earth theory. So this next slide, please. Next slide. So this is what is happening. That no, the previous slide, please. The movement is started. Our technique that we started, this is zero-till, no-till farming method. The movement has started. 3,000 farmers in our state has adopted it, and they all have become happy. And that is what is most important. Thus, I want to really confirm here that SRT resolves the paradox of plenty. This is something very important that this technique has developed. Let's go to the next slide, please. There is one more problem in agriculture, which I noticed in my past 45 years of farming career, that able youth is not interested in coming into farming. And this able youth is not coming, they're losing interest. That's because it's too monotonous. The farming job is too monotonous. Vagaries of climate change are affecting him negatively. It's less remunerative, and the most importantly, there is no dignity for doing this work. So the farmer is what if we don't get able youth, naturally the farmer is getting old, and agrotourism is a solution to this. You can see this is a unique ride that we give on our farm. We call it WB ride, water buffalo ride. This water buffalo ride, while we have a dairy, while we have a farming. So this is then we have guests who have been eating groundnut, peanut all their life, but they didn't know where the peanut came from. So they find it very happy moment. And our city brothers and sisters, they didn't know how solar energy is converted into gold. So through photosynthesis, this is something that we have been doing, and these are the solutions that we have got to protect paradox of plenty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shekhar. And I think every farmer, wherever they are in the world watching this, will have been nodding, as Sally and I were, at the synergies. There are the issues are exactly the same wherever you are in the world. It's protecting your soil, protecting your crops, protecting your herds, and finding ways of reconnecting and connecting with your communities as well. And I can see why it's not for nothing that they call you the godfather of agro-tourism in India, and we have a lot to learn. So thank you so much, thank you. I wondered perhaps we can now move to Konrad Brits, who, as Sally said, we were very honoured to have as our Frank Parkinson lecturer previously. He is the founder and CEO of Falcon Coffees. He spends a lot of time talking to and working with subsistence farmers across coffee making production countries, and has an awful lot of experience and a lot of thoughts that he's had around this subject. I mean, particularly that point of dignity that Shekhar has raised. I think he's got some very interesting points to make about that as well. So Konrad, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, I mean, my career's been purely coffee focused, and as a tropical crop, it and not an essential food crop like wheat. It probably feels quite far away from British agriculture, and perhaps less relevant to the the really big topics of food sovereignty and food security. What's interesting about coffee is, well, I mean, firstly, agricultural supply chains tend to have a common structure. They have the same process flow. They start with farmers who make the goods and move through the supply chain to the final consumer. I think what makes coffee supply chains both interesting and relevant is that they seem to contain all the possible risks and dysfunction that exists in food supply chains and agricultural supply chains. And I'll explain a bit why, but just because of where they are, coffee supply chains seem to really have amplified and magnified versions of these risks and dysfunctions. So it makes a good example. About 70% of the world's coffee is produced by an estimated 12 to 15 million smallholder coffee farmers in about 50 of the world's poorest countries. And anecdotally, that number has dropped from about 25 million smallholder farmers. So we've probably lost about 10 million in the last few decades. These coffee farmers are a subset of the 500 million smallholder farmers, as quoted by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the 500 million smallholder farmers that produce an estimated 70% of the world's staple food crops. I mean, this is a huge number of almost invisible people, really. These people, coffee farmers or food farmers, they're all vulnerable through poverty, food insecurity. They lack access to market, access to working capital finance. They lack land title and even access to inputs. And then coffee, like many of the staple food crops, wheat, rice, corn, soya beans, are traded against futures exchanges, which are largely based in the developing countries, the consuming countries. And these future exchanges are vulnerable to speculation. And the speculation can cause the prices to really yo-yo to highs and lows. And when these futures markets setting the base price are extremely low, that is often below the viable cost of production for these farmers. When the price is driven up to its extreme highs, the urban poor lose the ability to feed themselves. So, considering this sort of socioeconomic profile and the volatility, this is a grindingly difficult existence for farmers. And the result, which Shekhar touched on, is we're facing an aging global farming population whose next generation is urbanizing. They're looking at farming and they're saying, this really, it doesn't offer much dignity. We don't hold a place where our societies really respect and value us. And there's no real hope. The economics don't offer a path to a better future. In my opening statement, I mentioned that coffee is this magnified version of the risks and dysfunction. So while I've spoken about smallholder farmers, I think a lot of these commonalities, play out for the larger landholder farmers in the more developed countries as well. So coming back to coffee, is this vulnerable supply base really raises a very urgent question for us as an industry, and that is quite simply, where's the raw material going to come from in the future to feed this enormous demand growth? We have coffee becoming very popular in the growing middle classes of the populous Asian countries. So this same question, if you think about the food farmers, poses a much more dire question about national food sovereignty and global food security. If I could have the first slide, please. So on the internet, I just found a very generic example of an agricultural supply chain, and we've modified it slightly. And you can see it begins with farmers and ends with consumers. And in between, we have the aggregators, the millers, exporters, the cooperatives, traders, importers, manufacturers, and then finally these points of sale, to consumers, so supermarkets, restaurants, and other distributors. And when I look at a supply chain diagram like this, to me they're really the two most important participants bookend any supply chain. The one is the farmer that actually grows and creates the good. And then there's the consumer that is buying sort of these fractional units of the finished product. And those fractional spends generate the revenue that that gets unraveled and has to move its way back and pay for every single person and process, including the farmer. So everyone else in that supply chain, in between those two bookends of farmer and consumer, really exists to facilitate that relationship. We make our living inside facilitating that relationship. So there are common characteristics that are unique to the farmers and consumers in this diagram, ones that I see. Both exist in vast numbers, and both are faceless, invisible, and unknown. There's almost through the commoditization, there is a dehumanization of this connection between these two groups of people. And through the farmers and as consumers, through our individual activities, we seem quite powerless to really to affect the supply chain structures through which these goods flow. Farmers are selling to mass aggregators in the countries of origin, and consumers we buy from mass distributors. Another feature of the supply chain is really the number of times that these products change hands, and when they're bought and sold. But on that journey from farm to table, farm to cup, is every one of these participants is fending for themselves. They need to operate as cheaply as possible. They need to hold market share, and they need to make a profit. They need to protect margin day by day, deal by deal. So these very sort of short sales cycles that populate this entire supply chain. So the idea that if the farmers and the consumers really create the good and all the revenue, it just strikes me they're incredibly disempowered and far away from each other. For such vital participants. So, the supply chain structure is effective. It's effective, but this short-term buy low, sell high cycle inside supply chain seems quite predatory, and in the longer term, it feels that it's quite destructive. So the problem is not the structure of the supply chain, but it's this behavioral culture we have within our supply chains. There's a lot of talk of sustainability across the world, and with good reason. If we think of farmers as stewards of the land, stewards of our natural resources, our topsoil, our water, and our biodiversity, it really feels safe to say that every single business in that supply chain and every consumer that buy those goods we share in that responsibility of stewardship. We're holding farmers accountable for their farming practices. We have to share in that accountability. And from a business perspective, is the current sustainability conversation is really us as business people speaking about how we are striving to overcome these challenges in our supply chains, climate crisis, urbanization, poverty, and all the other challenges. And as business people, who are we speaking to? Well, we're speaking to consumers, our clients. These are the people at the end of the day that we need to convince to buy our products. So while the kind of the message and our actions are shifting in the sustainability conversation, the target audience and the purpose remains the same. You know, to sell our goods, to elicit confidence in our brands. So the result is a barrage of seals and slogans and claims to ethical standards. And you know, unfortunately, sometimes these are veneer thin, both in credibility and in substance. And as consumers, you know, we're overwhelmed. I mean, just sorting out my recycling is probably one of the most complicated domestic chores I do. So consumers are overwhelmed by the sort of array of options that are broad and complex, and it's become extremely difficult for us to make informed choices about how we reward responsible brands. So there's this, again, there's this cultural piece that crops up for me, is that this, you know, the traditional business model and sustainability are a cultural mismatch. You know, business, the purpose of business is the accumulation of profit, and that tends to be measured on very short-term profit cycles. You know, listed companies on quarterly results and private companies on annual. So it's very difficult on those short, you know, purpose cycles, if you like, to invest in addressing these really long-term problems. Well, it's becoming shorter and shorter, I suppose. The pandemic has been interesting. It's impossible to have a conversation and not in some way refer to that. You know, what it's revealed about sustainability in coffee is that, and for me, again, culture, we've cast farmers in the role of impoverished aid recipients, unable to help themselves, who have to rely on the benevolence of wealthy roasters and retailers to fund the solutions to their problems. Well, this has proved not to be a very sustainable or healthy model at all. You know, COVID stopped the money engine as restaurants and cafes closed, and so the benevolence dried up. So a lot of the initiatives and projects simply run out of funding. So it feels like that funding needs to find a new place on our balance sheet. You know, it needs to move away from special projects behind our brand and from charitable contributions. It needs to move into cost of goods. It somehow needs to become part of the cost of doing business. You know, if we're going to address these enormous challenges around climate crisis and resource depletion, we need to change our culture. And this is going to take conviction from corporate leadership, business ownership, strong legislation and political will. I was thinking of the story of, you know, the race between the tortoise and the hare, and this certainly feels like more of a race for the tortoise than the hare. In closing, I just wanted to share two simple slides that I came across. If you could put the next slide up, please. That really depicts the role of farming in the UK economy. Sorry. This is 1950 to 2016. The GDP and the split between services, manufacturing, construction, and agriculture. Inside of agriculture is also fishing and forestry. And that's alarming. And then the pink bit, obviously, is the agricultural piece. So countries' success and welfare and happiness has tended to be measured in a financial metric of GDP. You know, coronavirus has really threatened these extremely long supply chains, and food is critical. So, you know, when we, if you could put the next slide up, please, and it's really just in support of that slide. This is the number of people employed within manufacturing, services, and agriculture from 1841 to date. So, you know, when we think about food security and we think about food sovereignty, really highlighted by the pandemic and these lengthy supply chains, this it's clear that farming has a diminishing role and a diminishing number of people involved, which is clearly of concern. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Konrad, thank you so much. And yes, I mean, I think that's a very stark reminder of the convening power and the economic power that farmers internationally have to bear when it comes to looking for policy change or looking for a change to the way that the current system works. So we'll open up for questions, and I know we've got some fantastic questions already. We'll be addressing those in a few minutes, but not before we've heard from Daniel McGahey, who I think is a fantastic complement to our other two speakers. He has a wealth of academic experience in land management in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. He has worked in more countries than I even knew existed around the world, and has some really interesting thoughts about this whole concept of the paradox of plenty and how it affects farmers in other parts of the world. Daniel, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, pleased to be speaking to you today. Could you bring up the first slide? Is that possible? So yeah, basically, I'd like to give the perspective of Africa, I guess sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and drylands in particular, which is an area that I've specialised in over the last 22 years. I think drylands are really the key to answering this question in terms of understanding sub-Saharan Africa's vulnerability within the food system, and also to understand some of the pathways that we could help the continent to navigate through the challenges that are faced by climate change and by markets, global and integration into global markets. But they are key because they're 43% of the continent is covered by drylands, and 70% of the region's cropland is held within them, and also 66% of cereal production and 82% of livestock production. If you could just move on to the next slide. So in terms of understanding these systems, I'd like to focus on two production systems within this mix of landscapes. The first one being pastoralism and sustainable livestock production, which has had a bad rap internationally over the last few years, but under the right conditions, it is naturally regenerative. And these systems in Africa have been in existence for over 5,000 years, have generated some of the most biodiverse landscapes on the planet, responsible for great ungulate migrations in Eastern Africa and so on and so forth. They naturally regenerate soil, and they really can be part of the solution. But the problem with this system is it's historically been misunderstood. It's uniquely adapted to drylands. These areas have very different ecologies to what we might experience in Europe, and these systems are uniquely adapted. They know what they're doing, but they're multi-product systems, and they're not centered on one commodity, and the strategies that farmers deploy are very opportunistic. And so historically, there's been a lot of misunderstandings around this system, which thankfully have started to be reversed, and there's an enlightenment in the continent. And so it's an interesting one to look at in terms of a pathway out. The second one, if you could move on to the next slide, is the agroforestry system, which dryland agroforestry and smallholder production is the dominant system within these drylands. And these are farmers that have multiple products from these landscapes. There's energy, food, fodder, medicinal plants, and there's been a lot of regeneration and knowledge about how this system can actually regenerate soils and be part of the solution to improving productivity. There's evidence that soil health is improved, 15 to 25% yield increases for certain crops. So thankfully things are changing, but there are threats. And if we can move on to the next slide. Unfortunately, much as what Shekhar was saying, is that the dominant sort of approach has been to focus on mechanization and particularly around 1 or 2 or 3, export commodity crops. And what we've seen is, this has taken some of the key resource areas within these dry lands away from those other 2 systems, pushing people to clear more land for agriculture. But it's not all bad. I mean, part of the issue is a misunderstanding, and that, as I say, that is changing. So if you could move to the next slide. It's sort of understanding the values that are in these systems. So a lot of these systems are informal, so there's not a lot of data captured within national statistics. But when you do look at these systems and actually account for them, in certain countries they are significant. So that, if there's a dryland country that's particularly arid, we're looking at 80% contribution to agricultural GDP. So the contribution is significant, and there's a lot of informal trade is now becoming understood. In East Africa in particular, there's huge informal networks in the livestock trade which link as far as the Middle East, and the value of these systems are in excess of $1 billion US dollars. So a lot of this data is not captured. It's outside of the tax regime, and so it's about understanding those values. But if you could move on to the next slide, please. The other aspect of this is the potential for regeneration. So there's been a lot of examples now in West Africa, particularly, of farmers with very little input from governments and very little input from aid agencies have actually naturally regenerated trees on farmland within agroforestry systems. And if you can move on to the next slide, there's now a push and a lot of political will at scale to upscale this across the whole of the Sahelian region. So there's a lot of potential really for this. And if we can then just move to the next slide. I think to answer this question for me, I think there are 2 key issues. One is, as I say, trying to understand what values there are in these systems for crops which are naturally resilient. Particularly, in recent years, there's been a lot of focus on dryland resilient export crops like sesame, but there are a lot of natural products as well which can come from these agroforestry systems, and the global market for these products and demand for these products is increasing rapidly. So we see that with the shea market. There's very different, many diverse markets, including gums and resins, and which all enter the global food system. So it's about recognizing and protecting those production systems. And then if you could finally just move on. And another part of that really is to also, I think, understand the ecological footprint of these different systems. So there's been a lot of discussion about the dumping, I suppose you might call it, of subsidized surplus products into African markets. Well, Africa is urbanizing rapidly, so there is insatiable demand on the continent for livestock products, for dairy products. But there's if we looked at the footprint, we might have a different opinion. If we looked at camel production of dairy in West Africa, the water footprint and whatnot, we might actually have a different view on some of these markets, and we might actually protect and celebrate them locally, which would help, I think, dramatically. And then I think, yeah, that's really the key thing. And the other thing is the South-South trade is actually increasing rapidly. If you could move to the final slide. And I think it's not all doom and gloom. I think there's a lot of demand now for processed food. in urban centres, and we have, you know, the international free trade agreement now in Africa. So I think that a lot of these markets will be served by local entrepreneurs, and so we can celebrate that there is hope for Africa, and I think South-South trade is a key element of that.
Daniel, brilliant. Thank you very much, and a really nice note on which to end, I think, about the positives, the upside. I've been taking notes, lots of notes actually, as you've been speaking. And first of all, thank you to 3 outstanding speakers. And we should say that Shekhar has also been battling the monsoon, winds, rains, and interruptions to Wi-Fi. So thank you very much for joining us from India as well for that. I've got 3 words that came up as I was writing for all 3 presentations, and they were value, dignity, and resilience. And I wonder if I could perhaps unpack a little bit of those for each of you. Firstly, around value, and I all make the point that in different ways that farmers need to, in some way, discover the value of their own products, whether it's for Shekhar, it's adding value for an urbanized population to agro tourism, whether for Konrad it's the power of that convening power that allows you to have a greater say in your own market, or with Daniel, the value within a system that's already there. It's just understanding where the value sits in terms of external audiences. So I wonder if I could start by asking you all, how optimistic are you that those different bits of value that you've identified can be used to really begin to get the balance right in terms of dignity for farmers and power for farmers? I wonder, Shekhar, perhaps could we start with you? Oh, I think you're... Okay.
I don't...
Hi, Shekhar, can you hear me?
Yeah, I couldn't get the question properly.
Of course. So the question is, you mentioned very powerfully about agro-tourism and how farmers can get value back for themselves through...
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
I suppose the question is, how confident are you that this is a way that farmers can really bring some value back?
Thank you. That's a good question. I would like to answer that. And value, I have a word for that, is dignity. That means when farmer is doing such an important job for the rest of the community, at least in our country, in India, the farmer is looked down upon. He doesn't get, when he comes out in the society, he doesn't get that very valuable status in the community, in the program, or in the society. If you go to a bank, the bankers say no, farmers cheat for the money. When you go to a government office, the farmer is in the last position in a row. So to get that value, the farmer himself should feel confident, and that confidence can come when a city brother or a sister, a dignified person, comes to my farm and he says, wow, this fish is good, or this mango tree is wonderful, or this field of rice looks beautiful. So, and when farmer tells the name of the fish or the name of a wild plant which is useful for food, then he becomes a professor, he becomes a dignified person. So this gives confidence to the farmer, and a self-confident person in the society becomes dignified automatically.
I wonder if I could just ask a question from one of our viewers from Will, who has asked whether the Indian government is encouraging farmers to look at regenerative methods, the sort of methods you are using, Shekhar.
A very small change is happening. Initially, right now, our universities, agricultural universities in our country, they are talking about it, but they have not accepted my technique. They don't consider me a scientist because I don't get paid from anybody as a scientist. And my team works in the field, and our fields are our laboratories. So there is a change, but the change is very slow at the government level, at the university level. But at the farmers level, the acceptance is logarithmic. The movement has begun. I started on my own 5 years ago. There were 30 farmers. Now today we have got 3,000 farmers. And this is an effort done by only me and my small team and my family. So farmers are changing. They have accepted it. They have taken it over. Farmers, some of the farmers are able to speak the language of carbon sequestration, carbon incentive, climate smart agriculture, and they know these terms. They know that they understand the concept of it. But it's taking time for the scientists and the government to accept it.
Thank you very much. Konrad, I wonder if I could perhaps turn to you, because you spoke very powerfully, as did Shekhar, about dignity and the ability to have a voice in your own supply chain. I mean, do you think that are you hopeful that there is a chance to do that for coffee farmers and for farmers around the world in future? We had one question from Phil, I think it was, talking about how unfortunate the experience of some UK farmers has been in terms of cooperatives. Are there any lessons for us all to learn?
So am I hopeful? Yes, very. I would say the two big drivers behind that, the one is the digital revolution and the advent and rapid deployment of technology. And when we, certainly in coffee, when we talk about sustainability, it seems that the very first building block is traceability. You know, in these very opaque, faraway places, it's hard to have full visibility. So this drive to traceability, the beneficial and unintended consequences is the decommoditization of coffee, and it becomes a very human story, because traceability is about who is actually growing the crop. And I think that human connection is a great place to start. The other is the generational move of power. So we see number of voters and sort of disposable income, spending power in the economy. That generational change, moving to millennials, I think there's a far greater sense of responsibility, of urgency, and a demand behind brands and products and ethics. And so, you know, hopefully the business driver will be to use technology to provide insight into ethical behavior, and this will lead to a positive impact on farmers.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Konrad. Daniel, I mean, you spoke very powerfully, and it was a great way to end our set of presentations about the value that maybe farmers who are very involved in agroforestry, and of course we know this is something that farmers in the UK are thinking about as well, but it's an established farming pattern in sub-Saharan Africa, or parts of thereof, that they're beginning to realise the value of their own crop that they kind of didn't even know. Do you think, are you hopeful that this is a way that farmers can bring back that dignity and value? And I wonder, while you're on, if I could ask you a second question from Thee. He said, are we undermining African agricultural development by exporting European milk, as you maybe alluded to in one of your slides?
Yeah, I think it's, I think, much as what Shekhar was saying, I think dryland peoples are innovators, and when things take hold, innovations take hold, they soon spread. So that's particularly what we've seen in Niger and places like West Africa, where these new techniques, or they're not new techniques, they're old techniques that have been reinvigorated, have spread across large regions. So I think the value is there. Once these value chains are linked up, I think people will come back to the land, and you see that again and again with examples of although there is this mass movement towards urban areas. I think 2007 was a big transition period where there was more people in urban areas than rural, but there is, if the wealth is there and on the land, and if there is the opportunity, I think there is a good chance that these value chains and these systems can be the future really for production and resilient to climate shocks. I mean, that's one of the big challenges that is forthcoming, which we need to be concerned about, is that climate change is going to impact sub-Saharan Africa far greater than the northern hemisphere. So, most countries are net importers of food, and it's going to deepen that trajectory. So the time is now to think about really embracing these resilient crops and these resilient systems. And I think the future is bright if we can do that. And there are movements, as I said, to start that process. But yeah, I think that whenever these markets are try to link to the global food system, there are challenges as well, which and the dairy sector is a big one, a big example of that. So the way around that is just to try and move to protecting production systems based on their ecological footprint. I think Africa is a long way behind in that regard. So I think in Europe we're actually far ahead. We've got protected area of origin legislations and things like that, which really do help to protect sustainable production systems. So we need to work on all fronts really.
Thank you very much. Where has the time gone? It feels like 5 minutes since we were starting, and now we're almost at the end. So I'm going to have to ask, although obviously our speakers will be with us for our live lounge afterwards, but I've got to ask you if you could really briefly, maybe in 30 seconds, just sum up. We've had a question from Olivia asking about whether farmers should be paid for this natural capital, this regeneration, or is it something that farmers should just do because it's the right thing for their soils and for their land? So I wonder, Shekhar, may I start with you? Should farmers be paid to do regeneration, or should they do it because it's the right thing?
Yeah, carbon incentive is a idea which is not known to the farmers yet. In those 3,000 farmers who have already adopted it, they have adopted it, and the movement has begun because there are inherent built-in factors such as the dependency on weather, the dependency on labor, the dependency on the tractor. For the farmer is gone, it has become zero. His cost of production is reduced to half. His drudgery has reduced to 70%. These are the good enough factors why there is a curve of learning, 15%, 70%, 15%. The 15%, the early adopters, they have been adopting it quickly, and now they have been they are becoming example in their own local area. So carbon incentive will come later. The farmers are already changing. They are not waiting for anybody to come and tell them anything new about it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Shekhar. Sorry to cut you off, but we are very close to time. Konrad, do you think farmers should be paid to do this, or is it just the right thing to do?
I think the farmers need to be paid to do it. It's essentially, if someone is running a business that is losing money, their time horizons are very, very short. And if a farmer cannot feed his or her family and has a natural resource on their land and can exploit that resource to increase their income, they will. We all would. So, you know, this idea of this altruistic legacy, protecting this altruistic legacy for future generations of biodiversity on land that could be utilized another way, definitely needs to be incentivized through some form of remuneration.
Perfect. Thank you, Konrad. Daniel.
Yeah, I think that farmers, should be paid to do it, but the way to do that is just through valuing those products and making sure that we add the ecological footprint to these value chains, and I think that way they will be paid, and they'll get a higher premium for what they're doing.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I'll hand over to Sally in just a moment. Just may I say a huge personal thanks to our three fantastic speakers who spanned the world with their thoughts and indeed spanned the world with their attendance as well across 5 time zones. And thank you very much for the hundreds of questions we've had that we haven't been able to get to, but thank you for your attention. And I'll hand over now to Sally.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And to reiterate Sarah's point, thank you so much to our speakers for sharing your time and your inspiring thoughts with us. I'm always struck by the commonalities that as farmers and people involved in this great industry experience. It doesn't seem to matter what country or what continent. And I can definitely relate to Shekhar's comment on the drudgery, and I look forward to addressing and reducing my own. And I love the idea that Shekhar is talking about farmers not waiting to be told, that they're just getting on with it. And I think there's a huge lesson for everybody across the world, that instead of waiting for others to tell us what's okay or what's right to do, that actually we do just crack on. Thank you very much to our sponsors, Kubota, Sainsbury's, Fent, BASF, Adama, UKRI, and the Frank Parkinson Agricultural Trust for their continuing support to deliver these sessions and the conference itself in January. For the scholars and emerging leaders, the live lounge will open shortly. Please log on. You should have the log-on details already, and you'll be held in the waiting room and admitted once this session has finished. Our Scholars Programme for 2020 has now been launched. So if you are aged between 22 and 30, please have a look at our website for some more information. And I'm really pleased. We also have 2 breaking ballot, apologies, my mouth is getting carried away with the words. We have 2 breaking barriers scholar places to apply for. McDonald's have sponsored the overall Scholars Programme for the last 8 years, and we are delighted that they are also sponsoring these 2 wonderful places. The places will go to people who are passionate about food production and feeding people. They don't have to be working in the sector or have a qualification in the ag-food sector, but they must be keen to enter it. And again, there is more information on the website. Apologies for this outro having so much information, but it's really important to me that we convey everything we're doing. So on to Remo and the networking. When this session ends, you will automatically be placed on a table with active Zoom-style calls with other people. Unfortunately, if you're on a phone or a tablet, this isn't going to be supported, but please log on a PC or a laptop. And if you can't this time, then I hope you'll join us next time via PC or laptop. As I say, you'll be placed automatically on a table. You can move to any empty seat on any other table if, for whatever reason, you don't want to speak to the people you're randomly allocated with. There is AV support, so if you're struggling for any reason, please send a message directly to Hawk AV Tech Support. You'll see it, I think, on the right-hand side of your screen, I hope. You have 30 minutes to chat to other people. I really hope your diaries allow for the time, and I hope you really enjoy this new functionality that we've brought you. Please join us next time on Thursday, the 5th of November, for Farmers in Competition, chaired by Marion Regan of Hewlow Farms. In Marion's bite-sized session, we will be hearing from Tony Abbott, the ex-Australian Prime Minister, who has recently been appointed as a trade advisor to the new Government Board of Trade, and Minette Batters, who needs no introduction, the NFU President. Thank you very much for sharing your lunch hour with us, and I hope you will stay for some networking if your diary allows. See you on the tables. Bye-bye.